The morning of September 11, 2001, began like any other Tuesday in New York City. Commuters hurried through the streets, office workers grabbed their morning coffee, and the twin towers of the World Trade Center stood majestically against the clear blue sky, housing nearly 50,000 people who worked there daily. But this wasn't just a random act of violence. It was the culmination of years of planning, driven by ideological hatred and executed with chilling precision by 19 men who believed they were carrying out a holy mission. By the end of that day, the world would never be the same again. Al-Qaeda operatives had been quietly infiltrating the United States, learning to fly commercial aircraft at flight schools across the country, studying building layouts and establishing sleeper cells. These weren't desperate men from impoverished backgrounds, as many would later assume. Most came from middle-class families in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, and the United Arab Emirates. They were educated, some with university degrees, united not by poverty but by ideology and a shared hatred of American foreign policy in the Muslim world. The operation, codenamed the Plains Operation by its planners, was designed not just to kill Americans. Their weapons were simple but effective: box cutters, small knives, and the element of surprise. The terrorists had carefully calculated the delay between the first and second crashes, ensuring that by the time the second plane hit, every major news network would have cameras trained on the World Trade Center. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, piloted by hijacker Hani Hanjour, crashed into the western side of the Pentagon, the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense. Within minutes, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all aircraft in American airspace to land immediately, an unprecedented shutdown of the nation's aviation system. Fighter jets were scrambled, and the military went to its highest state of alert. Vice President Dick Cheney was rushed to a secure bunker beneath the White House, while President Bush, still in Florida, was urged by Secret Service agents not to return to Washington. The courage of those passengers prevented what could have been an even greater catastrophe, potentially saving the lives of hundreds of lawmakers and government officials. At 9:59 a.m., after burning for 56 minutes, the South Tower of the World Trade Center suddenly collapsed. Another 1,600 people perished in this second collapse. In the span of less than 2 hours, the iconic New York skyline had been forever altered. There were the 343 firefighters who rushed up the stairs as others fled down, never to return home. There were the Port Authority police officers who stayed at their posts, helping others evacuate even as the buildings crumbled around them. There were ordinary office workers who became heroes, helping disabled colleagues reach safety, and there were the desperate souls who, trapped above the impact zones with no hope of rescue, made the unimaginable choice to jump rather than burn. And nearly 3,000 innocent people had lost their lives. The sight of the 110-story skyscraper pancaking in on itself in mere seconds was beyond comprehension. Approximately 1,000 people died in the South Tower's collapse, including hundreds of firefighters, police officers, and emergency medical personnel who had rushed into the building to save others. The symbolism was unmistakable. After striking at America's economic heart in New York, the terrorists had now attacked its military nerve center in Washington, D.C. They wanted the world to watch America burn, and they had choreographed their attack for maximum visual impact. In 2001, airline security was vastly different from today. The concept of using airplanes as guided missiles was so unthinkable that cockpit doors were often left unlocked. Led by passengers like Todd Beamer, who uttered the now famous words, "Let's roll," and Tom Burnett, who told his wife, "I know we're going to die, but 3 of us are going to do something." The passengers of Flight 93 made the extraordinary decision to fight back. They charged the cockpit, forcing the terrorists to abandon their mission to Washington, D.C. and passengers were trained to comply with hijacker demands under the assumption that hijackings typically ended with negotiations and eventual release. United Airlines Flight 93, the fourth hijacked aircraft, was racing toward Washington, D.C., likely targeting either the U.S. Capitol or the White House itself. Unlike the passengers on the previous 3 flights, those aboard Flight 93 had learned of the earlier attacks through phone calls to their families. They understood that this was not a traditional hijacking where compliance might save their lives. This was a suicide mission, and they were going to die regardless. But to deliver a psychological blow that would shake the very foundations of American confidence. The impact was devastating, instantly killing hundreds and trapping thousands above the point of impact. Initially, news reports described it as a tragic accident, perhaps caused by pilot error or mechanical failure. United Airlines Flight 175 appeared in the clear blue sky, banking sharply before slamming into the South Tower between the 77th and 85th floors. This second impact, witnessed live by millions of television viewers, instantly transformed what had seemed like a tragic accident into an obvious and deliberate attack. The world watched in horror as the South Tower erupted in flames, and the terrible reality began to sink in. America was under attack. The idea that someone had deliberately flown a passenger jet into the World Trade Center seemed impossible to comprehend. The Soviet Union had collapsed a decade earlier. China was still decades away from becoming a global superpower, and the United States stood as the world's sole superpower. Like millions of others watching the breaking news coverage, Bush's first reaction was that this must have been a terrible accident. That assumption would last exactly 18 minutes. Since the late 1990s, a shadowy organization called Al-Qaeda, led by a wealthy Saudi exile named Osama Bin Laden, had been plotting what they called a spectacular attack against American targets. Bin Laden, despite his privileged background as the son of a billionaire construction magnate, had transformed himself into America's most wanted terrorist, driven by a radical interpretation of Islam that viewed American presence in the Middle East as an unforgivable desecration of holy lands. America's military, economic, and cultural influence stretched across every continent. The Twin Towers themselves had become symbols of American capitalism and global reach, featured in over 500 Hollywood films and recognized instantly by people worldwide. What unfolded over the next few hours would become the deadliest terrorist attack in human history, claiming nearly 3,000 lives and fundamentally altering the course of the 21st century. To understand the magnitude of September 11th, we must first grasp the world as it existed in 2001. This dominance, however, had bred resentment in certain quarters. The planning for what would become known as the 9/11 attacks began years before that fateful Tuesday. On the morning of September 11th, 19 Al-Qaeda operatives prepared for what they believed would be their final day on Earth. The terrorists divided into 4 teams, each tasked with hijacking a different commercial flight. At 8:46 Amara, American Airlines Flight 11, which had been hijacked by 5 terrorists led by Mohammed Atta, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center between the 93rd and 99th floors. President George W. Bush was reading to children at an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, when his chief of staff, Andrew Card, whispered the news in his ear. At 9:03 am, news cameras from around the world focused on the burning North Tower. The psychological impact of this timing was no accident, but the Twin Towers were not the only targets. The Pentagon attack sent shockwaves through the American government. Yet even as chaos engulfed the nation's capital, another drama was unfolding at 35,000 feet. What happened next would become one of the most heroic chapters in American history. At 10:03 am, Flight 93 crashed into a field in rural Pennsylvania, killing all 44 people aboard, but sparing whatever target the terrorists had selected in the nation's capital. Meanwhile, back in New York, the unthinkable was about to happen. 29 minutes later, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower followed suit, collapsing in a thunderous roar of concrete, steel, and glass. The human stories from that day are both heartbreaking and inspirational. The attacks didn't just claim lives. They shattered America's sense of invulnerability. For the first time since Pearl Harbor 60 years earlier, the continental United States had been successfully attacked by foreign enemies. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. In New York, a massive cloud of dust and debris engulfed Lower Manhattan, creating an apocalyptic scene that would haunt survivors for years to come. The cleanup effort would take months and cost billions of dollars, but the psychological wounds would take much longer to heal. Americans who had awakened that morning feeling secure in their homeland went to bed that night knowing that their country was vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. His words that night captured the mood of a grieving but determined country. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The families of several hijackers publicly denounced the attacks, with Mohammed Atta's father notably blaming Israeli intelligence services rather than accepting his son's role in the plot. The attacks fundamentally transformed American foreign policy, leading to the invasion of Afghanistan just weeks later and reshaping America's approach to national security for decades to come. The Department of Homeland Security was created, airport security was revolutionized, and surveillance programs were expanded in ways that would have been unthinkable before 9/11s. These denials reflected the difficulty many had in accepting that the attacks had been carried out by Muslims, given Islam's emphasis on protecting innocent life. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat, but they have failed, and that the price of freedom often includes the constant vigilance against those who would destroy it. The 2,977 people who died that day became part of a story much larger than themselves. Their sacrifice forever woven into the fabric of American memory and the ongoing struggle between those who would build and those who would destroy. They were particularly incensed by the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, home to Islam's holiest sites, which they saw as a desecration. The psychological impact on American society was even more profound, creating a generation that came of age knowing that their homeland was not immune from attack. They opposed American support for Israel, American sanctions against Iraq, and what they viewed as American cultural imperialism spreading Western values throughout the Islamic world. This backlash contradicted the very values that America claimed to defend and created new injustices even as the nation sought to respond to the original attack. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Financial markets closed, air travel was suspended, and major cities across the country went on high alert. The Freedom Tower stands where the Twin Towers once rose, serving as both a memorial to those who died and a symbol of America's resilience. But the world that emerged from the ashes of that September morning was fundamentally different from the one that existed before, marked by an awareness of vulnerability that had been lost, and a recognition that even the world's greatest superpower was not beyond the reach of those who wished it harm. President Bush, who had spent much of the day being flown to secure locations, returned to Washington that evening and addressed the nation from the Oval Office. The question that consumed Americans in the days following the attacks was simple: why? Why had 19 young men chosen to sacrifice their lives to kill innocent Americans? The answer lay in the complex web of Middle Eastern politics, religious extremism, and anti-American sentiment that had been building for decades. Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network viewed the attacks as retaliation for American foreign policy in the Muslim world. But even as the motivation became clearer, Many questioned whether bin Laden and his followers truly represented the religion they claimed to defend. The stock market plummeted when it reopened, the airline industry nearly collapsed, and the insurance losses from the attacks totaled over $40 billion. The ripple effects of September 11th extended far beyond that terrible day. The economic impact was equally significant. Perhaps most tragically, the attacks unleashed a wave of anti-Muslim sentiment across America, as innocent Muslim Americans found themselves viewed with suspicion and facing discrimination because of their faith. Today, more than 2 decades later, September 11th remains a defining moment in American history. The events of September 11th, 2001, remind us that history can change in an instant, that the unthinkable can become reality.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more engaging historical content.